Well, I want to say how grateful I am to Zool and to Trudy and to Bruce and to all of you for coming. And it's lovely to see so many familiar faces all together. Oh, and Alice Slater, my sorry.
All right, we're gonna fix the seating here. Phyllis, you're gonna come over here.
I want to go.
Kathy,
No, back here.
How are you?
Alice, come right here, Don.
I hope I didn't miss
I,
Hello, everyone. Okay, so wonderful. Now we can start. I was at the Catholic Worker Friday night, and I was so touched to be in that space where the newspaper is created. And from afar in Chicagoland, I read the newspaper very carefully to stay in touch with what's going on that's important. And one of the things I can tell from that newspaper is people are really trying to address, even though we never fully can, our racism, the racism in our country, the racism that has so much affected our history. And so I came across a quote from Phil Berrigan that I wanted to use Friday night, but I want to bring it to you here today too. It's just been on my mind so very much. Phil Berrigan likened racial injustice in the United States to a hydra. You know, the many-headed hydra, and you cut off the head and two more appear, and these frightful faces. And what he said is that this face of racism can really then turn on any place in the world. And I'll just read you more directly exactly what Phil Berrigan said. He said, "It makes a new face for every area of the world. The commonly dispassionate decision of the American people to relegate," now he was writing in 1965, "to relegate the African Americans to the cellars and slums of American life makes it not only easy but logical to enlarge our oppressions in the form of international nuclear threats." To enlarge our oppressions. And so that face, thinking of the hydra that turns to any new area of the world, is a face that turned to a country I knew very, very little about in 1990. And that was the country of Iraq. And I'd like to ask you today, during this time that I have with you, to spend some time with me revisiting what Kathy Green and I became very, very familiar with during the time that we spent in Iraq. And so I'm going to go through stories from my own memory, but I hope that this will possibly help us make those connections, connections between war and racism in our time. So I had mentioned Iraq was a country I knew very little about, but in 1990, I began to hear about a group that would call itself the Gulf Peace Team. And I'd spent close to a year in prison for planting corn on top of nuclear missile silo sites. So I thought, well, I have to be qualified peace activist, right? And I wasn't paying my taxes to the U.S. government. And so I applied to join this peace team, and my nose was way out of joint because I wasn't hearing word one. And I thought, well, what do you have to do to get in with this crowd? And then all of a sudden I got word that if I could appear in Boston in 3 days' time, I could join the Gulf Peace Team. So quick inoculations and passport, and I took a train to Boston, and there began quite an education for me. And so the Gulf Peace Team journeyed to Iraq, and we had this kind of outlandish notion that we would interpose ourselves between the warring parties. But, you know, the war that broke out, of course, was initially an air war, and we couldn't have been more irrelevant. We were playing ping pong in the desert but when the war broke out, I can tell you that we were not sure, we were sure the war was coming. I mean, George Bush's hypocrisy was incredible because as this massive army was mounting in Kuwait, George Bush said, "I will never be able to let a larger country invade a smaller one." And so we knew the war was coming, and the night that it began, it was 3 o'clock in the morning, our time out in the middle of the desert. And we all climbed out of our tents and blankets and sleeping bags and sat under the stars. And we were huddling, and as the planes went by, one after another, we began to wonder, can anything be left of Baghdad? But every dog in the region started barking. They'd never heard this kind of noise before, of these warplanes, of any planes. And the dogs barked and barked until I think they either barked themselves to death or they barked themselves hoarse. And I always thought that was a proper response to that war. Well, I have to say the war brought our team a little bit more together, because I never saw a group of peace activists who could find so many things to fight about in my life. The vegetarians were in squabbles with the meat eaters, and the people who didn't want to feed the cats with fleas were squabbling with the people who did want to make friends with the cats. And then there were the smokers and the non-smokers. And of course, at one point, some of the elderly British women who liked to sit down and smoke their cigarette, they call it a fag, were approached by some of the others who said, "Put out that cigarette, the light from your ash is going to attract the warplanes." And I remember one of the elderly British women taking a deep drag on it. "Oh, laddie, we smacked fags all through the blitz of London, what's your problem?" So we all had our differences, but the war kind of brought us together. So much so that, you know, while we were playing ping pong in the desert, we were having our meetings, we decided, I mean, this is crazy, we decided we'd have an international talent show. I mean, what do you do at Catholic Burger Retreats? You have a talent show. And so every country group was supposed to develop their talent. So we were 22 Americans amongst about 88 people total. So the Americans have to come up with something representative of our country, which is, of course, bombing the daylights out of the place where we are. And so I thought, oh, wouldn't it be great if we sang a Randy Newman song called Political Science, which is a spoof, S-P-O-O-F, spoof, on nuclear weapons. So I had carbon paper, and I copied out the lyrics, and I had all the Americans rehearse it. So I'll just give you the first two lyrics of this Randy Newman song. If anybody's ever been arrested with me in the women's jails, who've gotten the whole 9 yards, because that's what I read every day, people in prison. But anyway, it goes like this. No one likes us, I don't know why. We may not be perfect, but heaven knows we try. And all around, even our old friends put us down. Let's drop the big one and see what happens. We give them money. Are they grateful? No, they're spiteful and they're hateful. They don't respect us, so let's surprise them. Drop the big one and polarize them. Asia's crowded, Europe's too old, Africa is far too hot. Canada's too cold, South America stole our Nick. Let's drop the big one, there'll be no one left to blame us. Well, all the other internationals are looking at the Americans, hamming it up about nuclear war, and they do not think it's funny. They don't think it's one bit funny. And so, a Chicago priest who was a very good friend of mine, Bob Bosty, poked me and said, "You better get a new song, and get a new song quick." So I thought, I know a new song, and I'd like you all to sing it with me.
And we have copies, guys.
We have copies. And this is a song, and Trudy, where are you?
She's cooking lunch.
Trudy, don't we have a way to pull this up on
Yeah,
somebody's
everyone except me has a good cell phone. And so that YouTube thing, Zool, you want to use your, or Nick, yours was really strong this morning.
Yes. So the new song actually comes from, well, this, I heard it sung by a man named Roy Bailey. And it's about a little girl in Nicaragua. It's about a little girl in Nicaragua who becomes an orphan. And it's a very touching ballad. And I think if we pull it up on the cell phone, then we can sing it together. The song is called Maria Diaz. I'll tell you.
I got it.
I'll sing the first verse. It's very easy.
Oh, God. Are we tuned?
Not music.
Turn yours up.
You know who wrote this?
Roy Bailey is singing it.
Does anybody ever sing Tom Lehrer songs anymore? The one about nuclear war?
We'll all go together when we go.
Getting saving the hard times to last above the lifetime anymore. Seeing children die so young, such as fall beneath the run. As the nation cry for justice in a war. So those that strong to come one day, till her father far away, he was put into a truck with many more. No reason did they give as to why he should not live. It's just another mistake has been in the war. Maria tries to sleep at night. She says that you dream like black and white. Her mother says that her dreams will be no more. Till there's freedom in the land, tyrants are forever banned. And they let us build a nation without war.
This is the instrumental interlude.
This is the instrumental.
This is a solo. This is the instrumental solo. He'll come back.
For the lands of war and ruler heads are torn. But was she left or was she right when her mother died that night? Or was she just another orphan in a war? Look down in the sky, you can see God in your eyes. It's open to the wounds that lie below. And see that children have a chance to live, chance to dance. A chance in colors bright to see us grow. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Heavy words.
Oh, beautiful. What's your
Nick, what's the name of the song? What's the name of the song?
Maria Diaz.
It is Maria Diaz.
by Roy Bailey. Maria Diaz by Roy Bailey. Thank you, Kathy.
So, I also want to tell you just another couple of things from that time with the Gulf Peace Team. We were evacuated by the Iraqis, and we had made this pledge that we would stay and interpose ourselves, and it seemed like actually the U.S. military might come through this area where we were, and so the Iraqis understandably would say, we're getting out of here. And if they left and we stayed, it might have been the choice to die in the desert because we didn't have an independent source of food or of water.
No.
And so there was a lot of discussion. The British women felt we should just start marching toward the Saudi border. But, you know, we didn't know if there were landmines out there. Or, I mean, I don't think we really knew where the Saudi border was. And so there was this big question, should we go or should we not? So 12 of our number, we were 88 people, right, decided to form a circle and hold signs, just like Nick is there holding his sign, that said, we choose to stay, in Arabic and in English. Now, I couldn't bring myself to join that group of 12. They were my closest friends at the camp. We had gotten to be kind of tight, but it seemed to me that there were people doing videography, and it just wouldn't be fair if a video went out of Iraqi soldiers dragging the peace people across the desert when actually they were trying to save our lives and they'd been pretty hospitable toward us. So I didn't join that circle. But the man that came to accomplish the evacuation was a man named Tariq. And I'd gotten to know Tariq pretty well. He had come back and forth to the camp and he spoke English well. And the buses were all pulled up waiting for us to board. And Tariq spotted the circle of 12. And he came up to me and he said, excuse me, Miss Kathy, but what am I to do? And I said, oh, Tariq, believe me, nobody in that circle means you any harm. And they never want to disrespect you, but they're not going to be able to get on that bus themselves. It's a matter of conscience. And Tariq, he didn't miss a beat. He walked up to the tallest man in that circle, somebody about Nick's size, but add a couple of inches there. And that was Jeremy Hartigan, who was also a Buddhist. So Jeremy Hartigan is holding his sign and chanting, Om. I mean, this can't get more surreal, right? Tariq walks up to Jeremy Hartigan, kisses him on the forehead. He says, Baghdad. And then he and another civilian and 2 soldiers, you know how you used to play levitation when you were a kid? And that's what it looked like to me. They picked Jeremy Hartigan up, gently carried him to the top step of the bus, placed him down, said, Mister, you okay? And I thought, holy crap, these guys ought to be teaching nonviolence. And they can start with the Chicago police, because that's not how that crowd does it. And that's how they proceeded to evacuate the other 11 people in that circle. And meanwhile, back in the United States, people are thinking about the, world's largest marauding, dangerous army next to the United States, the 4th largest, rather. You know what, Kathy and I, we just didn't meet those evil Iraqis. The time of economic sanctions was so very, very difficult for Iraq because, they had gone through the Iran-Iraq war, some had gone through chemical warfare. They had wanted so much to be free of war, and then an economic war started to claim more and more and more lives. And our group called Voices in the Wilderness thought that we could perhaps awaken in the United States public rejection of these economic sanctions. They were so cruel, and there were children, hundreds of thousands of children who were paying the price. And so we started breaking the sanctions as often as we could. We went back and forth with delegations. And at one point, we had Adolfo Pérez Esquivel and Mairead Maguire, 2 Nobel Peace Laureates, willing to go to Baghdad with us. And we thought, oh, this is very good. And they sent me in early to work out an itinerary so that it would be something that would be worth their while. And so when we first met Adolfo Pérez Escobar, who was the Nobel Peace Laureate from Argentina, we presented him in Spanish and English with this itinerary that we thought he'd be so pleased with. And he looked it over, and he definitely wasn't pleased. And he had a big frown on his face. And we said, is there something missing? And he said, yes. When do we meet with the teenagers? Oh, the teenagers. Yes, well, we'll work out some. So actually, we did have some schools we could go to. And we took Adolfo Pérez Escobar to meet with the teenagers. And I want to just give you my remembrance of a couple of 16-year-old girls and what we learned from the teenagers. And I'm sure they rehearsed this ahead of time. But still, these were the voices that I believed people in the United States needed to hear. One girl stood up and she said, "Can you tell me, what is the difference between me, I am 16, and someone she is 16 in your country? I'll tell you, our emotions are frozen. We cannot feel." But she could feel, and she sat down and she was crying. And the girl next to her stood up. And she said, "My father runs the electrical company in this city. And in our home, we have no electricity. And my grandmother weeps for her grandchildren who have been killed. What is the fault? What have we done? And what would be done to us if we were to do to any other country what is being done to us now?" And that was what the teenagers had to say. Well, Nick and I are so fortunate because we're now working with a girl I met when she was 8 years old in Baghdad, Sally Al-Ghazali. And once a week, sometimes twice a week, she meets with us. She just graduated from law school, passed the bar, did her last year at Georgetown. And she's a bright young Iraqi woman who's helping us with the Emergence of Death campaign, helping us enormously. So there are some silver linings that do come through. But I also want to tell you that during that time of economic sanctions, some of the really horrific moments were experienced by medical doctors. And Kathy Breen has gotten to know some of them and stayed in very close touch. And I remember a doctor, Feras Al-Abbas in Basra, telling us that the hospital was down to one blood bag that day. And in the morning, a woman gave birth to a baby, and she needed blood. She needed blood badly. And an infant had come into the hospital, and the infant, and he said, "How do I make the choice about who is going to get the blood?" There was also a day when I myself was following a pediatrician around on his rounds, and people started screaming for him. They had to because there wasn't any electricity, so there's no sound system that works within the hospital. People just yelled. And so he went running, and I kind of ran after him. And he went to the bedside of a little baby girl whose mother was just frantic. The child couldn't breathe. And so they gave her mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. The doctor did that. And then the doctor stood up, Dr. Qusay Al-Rahim, and he folded his hands in front of him. And he looked at the mother and he said, "I'm sorry. Your child, she cannot live. We have not the plastic." And the mother couldn't believe it. Because of the economic sanctions, they'd run out of plastic tubing. And the plastic tubing they did have was the size of a pencil. And the little girl's nostril was the size of the point of a pencil. And so the plastic tubing was useless. And so the doctor walked away. And the mother pulled me into the bed with her. They sit on the beds with their children. And my shoulder was damp from her tears. And then she said to me, "Please believe me, I pray that this will never happen to a mother. She is from your country." And that's the kind of prayer that we heard. Now I want to tell you something about my own mother. And I loved my mother very, very much, and my mother was a good woman. She was a woman with kind of Irish mother wit. and she was warm, and she was, in many ways, a protective mother to all of us. But as she got older, she started watching Fox News.
Oh, no.
And so, when I come back from Iraq, my mother knew that I was very, very upset. I'd been there all through the 2003 shock and awe bombing with Kathy, and it was shocking, and it was awful, and we saw plenty. And so I think my mother kind of wanted to comfort me. And so what she said to me in her lilting Irish voice was, Kathy, dear, what you don't understand is that the people of Iraq could have gotten rid of Saddam Hussein a long time ago. And they should have. And they didn't. And so we went in there and did it for them. And they ought to be grateful. And they're not. We went in there and did it for them. And they ought to be grateful. And they're not. And in some ways, that's what Fox News keeps on dishing up to us in war after war after war. We are always not the monstrous face of the Hydra showing the true colors of our capacity for oppression. We're the victims, or we're somehow the good guys. And so our merchants of death keep on going to the bank. Their portfolios are stuffed. They're making so much money in their greed and in their insatiable desire to continue war making. And it just goes on and on. And that's why we're now trying to plan the Merchants of Death War Crimes Tribunal to hold these companies accountable. So on November 10th, Nick and Sally and our friend Brad Wolf, and I'll bet Ann will be on hand for it at the National Lawyers Guild, they're going to go to places in Washington, D.C. where the headquarters are located for Boeing, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, General Atomics. And they're going to deliver enlarged subpoenas and say, you have to hold yourselves accountable to the average ordinary people. That's what we're calling for. So you would all be very, very welcome for that. I want to tell you one more story from Iraq. We had chances to go into Iraqi institutions, and sometimes the reporters would be angry because they couldn't get permission to go anywhere. And we were, yeah, you want to go there? Sure, get a driver's license. So we went to a university several times. And I had a chance to get to know some graduate students from the Baghdad University who were studying English literature. And I thought that was fascinating when we did. And so I was trying to figure out, well, what are you studying in English literature? And I was just gobsmacked. It turned out these Iraqi graduate students were studying the poetry of Wilfred Owen. And Wilfred Owen was a poet who died in the trenches of World War I. And Wilfred Owen had experienced chemical warfare, and actually so did many of the Iraqi soldiers during the Iran-Iraq War. And so together we looked over one of the particular poems, and I happen to know that one by heart in English, and so I want to offer you that poem from Wilfred Owen's experiences in the trenches of World War I when chemical warfare was being used. And Wilfred Owen wrote, if you could hear at every jolt, the blood come gargling forth from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitten as the vile cut of incurable sores on innocent tongues, you would not speak, my friend, with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory, the old lie, dulce decorum est, pro patria glory. The old lie, sweet and honorable it is to die for your country. And can you imagine, these Iraqi graduate student women are studying Wilfred Owen's poetry. Now, it might have been because Sassoon, who was Wilfred Owen's lover eventually, was born in Baghdad. There might have been something to do with that, but I think the chemical warfare connection might also have been there. So I just want to leave you with one other set of lines from Wilfred Owen's poetry. In one of his poems, thinking about World War I, he used the image of Father Abraham, who sends his son Isaac off to gather the wood, to make the funeral pyre, to sacrifice the son, because Father Abraham says the great God wants me to do this. And then Wilfred Owen changes Father Abraham into the heads of Europe in World War I. And he, in the biblical story, there's a ram in the bushes, more or less, and the angel of the Lord says to Abraham, knock it off, go get that ram and sacrifice the ram and offer the ram of pride instead. And so here's how Wilfred Owen ends his poem. The angel of the Lord said, lay not thy hand upon the lad. See in the thicket a ram, offer the ram of pride instead. But the old man would not so, and slew the son, and half the seed of Europe, one by one. The old man would not sow. He slew the son, and half the seed of Europe, one by one. World War I, World War II, so much war unleashed. Of course, it's got an intergenerational traumatizing effect. And then you also have the war that the United States unleashed on the original peoples who lived here. You've got the wars that we made in our terrible warfare against African Americans, our wars against the poor. It is a terrible sickness that we are inflicting still on other places. And so I want to close with some ideas that we also thought about Friday night at the Catholic Worker. There was a man named Bartolome de las Casas, who was a Spanish friar, a Dominican monk. And he spoke out against against enslaving what they then said were Amerindians. He said, those people have souls. And this was a radical, unheard of, almost heretical idea. But he kept on pushing it and getting others to, and so eventually in the Iberian Peninsula, Portugal decided, all right, we'll tell our slavers not to go out and capture the Indian people in South America and Central America, but they can just go get the African people. And so Bartolome de las Casas kept on struggling with these ideas. And too late in life, he finally did come across the truth that, of course, you ought not enslave Africans either, that African people had souls. I don't know really what's meant by who's got a soul and who doesn't have a soul. But I do know that Bartolome de las Casas, although he may have felt he was a terrible failure in his time, because they didn't abolish slavery completely, nevertheless, the writings that that man left behind formed the basis for human rights law today, for Amnesty International, and for Human Rights Watch. 100 years later, what you're saying today, what you're working on today, Alice Slater, be sure of it, will, if we survive that long, become, I believe, the basis for a far more humane and civilized possibility. So I'd like us to join in singing the song Freedom, so that we can celebrate being free from all the warmongers. And this is a gospel spiritual. Oh, freedom, oh, freedom, oh, freedom over me. Oh, and before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave. And go home to my Lord and be free. No more weapons. No more weapons. No more weapons. No more weapons over me. And before I'll be a slave, I'll be
home to my home and be free.
Why don't you catch your breath and take some questions, and then we'll have a little discussion for just a short while. So, Kathy.